Now, we would like to introduce to you at this time our after-dinner speaker, the Reverend James Edward Pender. You can see from your program that Reverend Pender is from Crown Point, Indiana. Reverend Pender received his formal training at Indiana State University. He received his bachelor's degree in social science. He has also received some formal training at Boston University, receiving a Bachelor of Sacred Theology at that fine school. Reverend Pender is with the Board of Christian Social Concerns, that is the Northwest Conference, the Methodist Church in Crown Point. That sounds like a rather long, involved title, but I should identify that more specifically, he is chairman of the Division on Alcohol Problems and General Welfare. Reverend Pender has a particular interest in pastoral counseling and has had considerable experience in some of these concerns we've been talking about this evening. We certainly recognize Reverend Pender as being someone who is not directly involved in the school system. However, we can make note that Reverend Pender works in cooperation with the school system, and this is a dimension, of course, that we're interested in hearing about tonight. So without any further comment, I'd like to introduce to you at this time Reverend Pender, who will talk to what we must do in sex education, or to improve sex education in the local community. Reverend Pender.
Dr. Block and members of the symposium and these lovely ladies that have been to my left and all of you who are there, I'm glad to be here, for you all know that a clergyman is glad to be any place that he can do the talking. And I feel as though that I have the unfair advantage of having the most time to speak uninterrupted and the least to say. I'm especially glad that I could sit in on the symposium this afternoon and listen. I'm glad to be here because in trying to have something to say this evening, I was forced to do some reading, which I would not have done. And I know the tremendous influence that the public school system had upon my life, and the important job that you people, along with us parents, have to do. And I am very much experienced in this field of sex. I'm the father of a 12-year-old daughter, a father of a son who will be 10 in December, and I'm excitedly the expectant father of a child to arrive in May. Now, in talking or corresponding with Dr. Schaller, I described myself as a disciplined amateur, and I stole that phrase from Dean Miller of Harvard University. I see myself as a person in contact with most of life and most of the institutions of society. Am I blasting you out? Am I too close on this mic? You know, I preach in a square dance hall on Sunday mornings, and really, I do. I don't have a building. I preach in a room about this size without any advantage of public addresses. So I may blast you out. And I know a little bit about a lot of things and a lot about very few things. And among these things that I know a little bit about are sex education and the public school system. And by now you're wondering, why in the world am I here? Well, I'm here to share with you some of my thoughts about sex education in the local community. Now, that's an ambiguous word, community. For in many sectors of urban society today, there is no semblance of the traditional use of the word community as belonging to one another. And so when I say local community, I mean any grouping of people such as a town, or a suburban township like I live in, a school system, a neighborhood, any continuing grouping of people. That's what I mean by local community. So I'm going to talk with you about the relationship of sex education in the public school and all the other institutions of your community. The first thing I want to say is very obvious, and yet I'm not sure we believe it. Sex education is everybody's business. Time magazine, a couple of years ago, I believe it was in January of '64, that's been almost 3 years ago, said that at times it seems that all of America is a sex machine. And across the continent, continuously, people are stimulated. And coming from the screen are sex images. And off of the radio and the television are the pop tunes. Sex will save you, sex will save you, sex will save you. And these mass media teach at times something like this. Sex is a product to peddle. Sex is an emotion to exploit, an entertainment to enjoy, an escape from emptiness. And in its more responsible moments, the mass media of America teach the loneliness of an unwed mother, the tragedy of the inhuman hostility toward homosexuality, and the plight of the unwanted child. You see, mass media is in the sex education business. And so is the peer group. A Purdue University poll of 1,000 boys and girls indicated that 1/2 of them got their sex information from their friends. And an extreme example of poor peer group education was cited in the Good Housekeeping of November '65. A principal in a prosperous Midwest suburban school heard of a Look and Learn club. And he discovered that the club was composed of 13 boys and 7 girls under the age of 16, all from respectable homes, who met together for the purpose of sex play and observing sexual intercourse. And the club members explained, "We don't want to be squares when we get to high school. If you don't know all about it when you get to high school, you'll be laughed off the hill." Now, of course, not all sex education by the peer group is so inadequate. Think of the teenage boy with 5 or 6 years of school ahead of him who said it's kind of ridiculous to hurry things up. I mean, there's so much else you can do besides sex. Or here's another teenager says a fast person is someone who does not particularly care about the other person. He's just out to get something for himself. Along with the peer group, the home is in the sex education business. In that excellent public affairs pamphlet number 149, displayed out here, How to Tell Your Child About Sex by James Himes, Mr. Himes reminds parents that sex training is a long-term project. It begins at birth, not adolescence. And no parent escapes the responsibility of sex education. Oh, he may try to dodge it. He may refuse to talk about it. But in his refusal to be open and honest and frank, he communicates to his child his attitude towards sex. And then there's that parent who is open, who does try to do a good job, but doesn't know enough. He knows a code of conduct for himself. in his circumstances. But he can't quite understand the circumstances in which his son or daughter finds himself. And he wants help, and where does he turn? Well, he goes to a friend, or he goes to the local library, or he goes to the physician, or he goes to the Board of Health, or he comes to the public school, or to his clergyman. And so the church is in the sex education business. Last spring, in an adult discussion following a sermon in which I had said something about sex, one of the mothers said, "What am I going to tell my 9-year-old daughter?" And there were the nods of heads and the grunts of assent. And I said, "What about our getting together one night and talking about this?" And they said, "Okay." Well, Dr. Hester Beth Bland happened by the day we were to get together to talk with me about alcohol problems, and she said, "Would I be imposing to come this evening?" I said, "Imposing? You're going to be a resource person." And so we showed the film Human Reproduction, and she joined in the discussion with 35 people in our living room. And out of that came this fall in our church a series of 3 meetings with adults in which I dealt with these topics: developing Christian attitudes towards sex, how to tell your child about sex, weathering the sexual storm with your teenagers. Last summer, our Methodist Sunday School literature for the 3rd and 4th graders was entitled "God's Universe Speaks to Me." You'll find that out on the coffee table. I guess they only have coffee tables in the student union, not cocktail tables, or do they? And in this was chapter 9, Man is Created. And there in the Sunday school book were included pictures of the development of the fish, the chicken, the rabbit, and human embryo. Now, this Sunday evening I'm going to talk with our young people about the care and feeding of parents, which is a sneaky way of talking about adolescence. And I'm going to say to them the same thing I said to the parents on weathering the sexual storm with your teenagers. Well, I wrote to several of the major Protestant denominations to find out what they're doing. And I asked them 3 questions. Do you include a plan of sex education in your church school curriculum? And almost all of them said, yes, we have it now, or it's in the curriculum that's soon to come off the press. I asked, do you have special studies in sex education for children, youth, and adults? And they said, yes, and we include in most of our magazines articles about family life, parenthood. We have done a little bit of teaching of teachers in sex education. And I ask, has your church made official statements on sex education and Planned Parenthood? And some have not, and some are in the process of formulating statements. But all of these denominations, the United Presbyterian, the Episcopal, the Methodist, the American Baptist, the Disciples of Christ, and the United Church of Christ, are doing something and planning to do more in sex education. And if you want to see samples of what they're doing, again, go out to that coffee table. Of course, there are many clergymen who work with couples in premarital interviews and marital counseling. Some clergymen, in addition to pamphlets and books, use limited testing. Now, don't misunderstand. I'm not saying the church is doing an adequate job in sex education, but it is in the sex education business along with everybody else, and so is the public school. Well, some systems have well-defined plans. Some hit it with a film once a year. Some try to ignore it. All teach it, whether they want to or not. An English teacher in an inner-city school recently told me that he assigned to a group of high school students this question to answer in essay. Why should getting married give you the right to go to bed together? That's sex education. A girl in a premarital interview with me once said, sex is one of those things you have to put up with in marriage. I said, oh, where'd you get that idea? My home ec teacher. She told me how she sleeps in a different room from her husband and she has her separate bank account. She told us all about it. That's sex education. You see, sex education in the local community is everybody's business. Now, the second thing I'm going to say is just as obvious, and you know it better than I do. Sex education is confusing and controversial. From the standpoint of health, the need is urgent. 500,000 teenagers contact venereal disease annually. From the standpoint of social deterioration, the alarm is loud. 1 out of 5 girls in America being married are pregnant. A Methodist pastor in a nice little country town told his congregation that 50% of the girls he had married in 4 years' pastorate were pregnant. In 1964, there were 180,000 abortions on high school girls. 50% of all of the girls 18 and under are pregnant when they're married. 80% of high school age boys marry girls who are pregnant. And yet, in the face of this urgent health problem, this loud-sounding alarm of social deterioration, there is strong resistance to do anything. One of my fellow ministers preached a sermon on morals in a Kinsey age, and some of the faithful thought it was so inappropriate that they went to another church in protest. Another young preacher preached a series of 4 sermons on sex, and he said 10% of his people went to another church, but they grabbed up the mimeographed copies of the sermon. My family physician said that seldom a girl asked him for a pelvic examination before becoming a bride because of gossip, fear, and embarrassment. Now, the public schools of America don't know what to do, or even whether to do anything about it. That vast New York City system ignores sex education. And Evanston, Illinois, systematically plans programs from kindergarten up. A father in Indianapolis protested. I don't know whether he protested this to you, Mrs. Jackson, or who. But he said, I don't pay taxes for my girl to go to school to learn dirty words. But another said, I'd rather have my youngsters learn sex in school than in the street. And the mother in Evanston said, I'm just afraid that telling our children how sex works will make them want to try it out. Now, there are repercussions when you get into this sex education business. I was talking with a Roman Catholic priest from Bishop Knoll. My Catholic priest friends call that the manufacturing center up there. They have 4,000 students in this high school. His name is Father Kenny. And he said that they showed one of these antiquated pictures on VD. And it was strongly stressed that one of the common traits, doggone it, I see you already, one of the common traits of venereal disease is baldness. And Father Kennedy is bald. And he said all these animals went down the hall saying, Good morning, Father. Good morning, Father. It's got repercussions. It's confusing. It's controversial, but it's with us. Now, the third thing I want to say is that let's say it this way. Sex education is teaching all the facts of life. I almost said sex education is more than the facts of life. But by the facts of life, I mean the physiological, the psychological, the sociological, and the ethical. I like very much Evelyn Duvall's inclusive definition. She may have put it other places. I happened on it in her new book, Today's Teenager. And for those of you who like references, it's page 125. Sex education includes the knowledge, skills, attitudes, and values involved in being boys and girls, in maturing into men and women, and in finding one's personal role as a member of one's own sex in courtship, marriage, family life, and the larger community. It covers the usual behavior expected of persons in their many relationships with one another, and some understanding of the conduct that departs from normality. Now, it seems to me there is no one better equipped than the public school to teach the physiological facts of life. You have the people who are trained or who, with a little additional training, can become more expertise than any parent or any clergy. And you are the only institution which has all of the children. Now, I gotta say that again, because one of my friends said, you've got to say that. You are the only people who have all of the children. Now, you're thinking about the parochial schools. Well, now, we got a pretty good parochial school system up in Lake County, but only 50% of the Roman Catholic students are in it. Now, a staff member of the National Council of Churches, you've always got to quote somebody out there to back you up. But I thought you might want to hear this, because I had the feeling that when he answered it, he expected me to quote him. He wrote me, when we realize that in any local community, all of the religious groups together are reaching less than half the young people, we feel there is a responsibility in supporting the public school administrator and educator in an attempt to help the total community develop sound knowledge regarding the sexual aspects of mental health. But we cannot stop with the physiological facts. We must go to the psychological facts. We must talk openly with youth about the differences in the way males and females respond to sexual stimulus. We must provide opportunities for youth to ask questions and to voice fears. Elsie Jones in the Washington, D.C. school system says that at least once a year, an 8th grade girl comes to her and says, if I don't have sexual intercourse before I'm 16, will I go crazy? We must help the youth see his sexual sensitivity in the context of his other new sensitivities to life. Help him see that as he is now acutely aware of how others view him, he is also acutely aware of the ugliness and the beauty in the world of which he is a part. Help him see that as these radical physical changes are taking place in him, there are radical psychological and social change taking place in his life. Help him to understand that it isn't peculiar for girls to begin to bleed between the legs, that it isn't peculiar for boys to wake up from wet dreams. You see, our sex education must say to our children, these things are normal. You're not a freak. And our sex education must also move into the sociological facts. Sexuality in society, role of male and female. Our task is to raise the questions to which no one here has the answer. Who is a man today? Who is a woman today? What is masculinity and femininity in the United States today? A little over a week ago, I participated in a one-parent family conference in Lafayette. This was for people who still have children in the home, who either by divorce or death or separation are rearing the children alone. And one thing stood out. Most of the people there were hoping to get remarried. They said in the church, in the club, in society, you don't feel at home without a mate. Now, what is the sexual role of the single person in a sex-saturated, family-oriented American culture? I'm convinced that we've got to begin talking about these roles in society at the very earliest days of our opportunities in school. I mean in kindergarten. Now, I know nobody in the United States has the answer. This makes it even the more urgent that we start early and stay with it long. For a resource, I wish I could just stay with this all night, but let me give you a resource that's helpful to me. There's a book called Sex, Family, and Society. The editor is J.C. Wynn, W-Y-N-N, Association Press. And in it is Chapter 7 by Dr. Cynthia D. Weddle, W-E-D-E-L. I think you'll find this helpful on sexuality in society, male and female roles. Our sex education also must include the ethical, a code of conduct. Now, you may have been with me up until this point, but I can imagine if I were sitting out there and I were a public school person, I'd begin to disagree. And I'd ask, what code of conduct? Whose ethical position? And if I asked those questions, I could go to such an outstanding, revered magazine as the Saturday Review and turn to Paul Woodring, the education editor. If you want a reference here again, let me see. That's in the December 8th, 65 issue. And this is what Mr. Woodring says. The schools and colleges can and should continue to teach the facts and principles relating to sex that are part of biology, psychology, and sociology. But when they venture into the moral issues, we doubt that teachers are better qualified than parents. Well, I sure agree with that. But that's not the question. The public school has no choice as to whether it's going to teach values or not. Let me show you. If the school says these are the cold physiological facts of human anatomy and reproduction, it is saying sex is a cold physiological fact. It is saying that the human being is a mammal, which is a type of animal, and it is natural to mate. Now, I doubt that anyone does say this. But if he does, He's teaching a value system in sex. If the psychological facts of sex are taught only as a description of how men and women respond differently to sexual stimulus, then the sex education becomes training in technique of manipulation and exploitation of other people, resulting in promiscuity. I doubt that this is done. But if it is, a value system is taught. If the sociological roles of male and female are presented in a rapidly changing sort of society as ours, without any statement of preference by the instructor, then the value system is imparted that it does not matter whether you are a prostitute or a wife. To me, it's absurd that some suggest we can teach sex without conscious value judgment, when we would not think of teaching government, English, economics, automobile driving without value judgment. It's both ridiculous and impossible to say that you're going to talk to somebody about one of the most powerful drives in his life and not connote any values. Now, I notice that the National Education Association in their pamphlet, What Parents Should Know About Sex Education in the Schools, say, as with so many other areas affecting society as a whole, driving, and by the way, they were afraid to say drinking, but they got to get that in there. That'll come in a few years. As with driving, smoking, narcotics, you see that they left drinking out like they're going to say sex, but we always leave out the important things in life. The real problems we're always afraid to say anything about. Now, I've messed up the quote, haven't I? All I'm going to say is that they say that you got to get involved in values. If you want to look that up, it's in that little pamphlet, What Parents Should Know About Sex Education in Public Schools. And still, I think most of you public school people will ask me, whose value system will we use? My first answer is a question. Whose value system are you now using? And I next would tell you that the three major religious groups, Roman Catholic, Protestant, and Jewish, have published a joint statement on marriage and family life in the United States. And you can get this either by writing the Catholic Welfare Agency in Washington, D.C., the National Council of Churches in New York, or the Synagogue Council of America, New York. The one address I know off the top of the head is for the National Council of Churches. That's 745 Riverside Drive, and after they run up and down the floors of the skyscraper, it'll finally land in the right office. Now, I would further say that I think there is a consensus among responsible adults on a code of conduct. I know that Dr. Kinsey clearly showed that we give lip service to one code and practice another. And by the way, William Graham Cole, you know I'm hurrying and I got to slow down or you won't understand me. William Graham Cole, the author of Sex and Love in the Bible, which was published in '59 by Association Press, which is the only systematic treatment of the subject that I know of, says that Dr. Kinsey shows we Americans are biblical, obedient to the injunction, don't let your left hand know what your right hand is doing. But how many responsible adults in your local community is going to come out and say, I don't believe that you should teach the code that it is better to wait until you're married, that it's better to stay with one spouse. Oh, yeah. Who has broken the code and is going to stand up and publicly announce it? Hugh Hefner. Have you ever been to the Playboy Club? Huh? How many of you read Playboy? How many of you have ever read Playboy? I have. Now, don't be ashamed of it. Gosh sakes. You don't have any right to be teaching in the classroom unless you get acquainted with Playboy. Oh, you don't have to read it all the time. It's the same old stuff. And all you have to do at the Playboy Club is walk in the front door and you've seen it all. You ought to go to Playboy Club. One thing that I came away from Playboy Club in Detroit, and that's sneaky of me to go all the way to Detroit instead of Chicago. One thing I came away from Playboy Club realizing was that Hugh Hefner had integrated, but the church hadn't. Now I know there will be some troublesome guy who will object in the local community to any code of conduct that you try to teach. But I also know that anything of great importance to humanity is controversial and confusing, and you can't ignore it. And the fact that there is no clear, absolute, commonly agreed upon, spelled out code of conduct in sex does not exempt you as public school people from offering some code of conduct. Now I'm to the last thing, believe it or not, that I'm going to say. You know what last means? A little while now. Successful sex education in the local community can happen only when the community understands and supports it. Whose value system are we going to teach? This is one of the questions with which responsible people in each local community must wrestle. I was interested in what Mrs. Jackson said about Mrs. Calderon, is it? Calderon. I didn't know what to do with the E on the end of it. She contradicts you in the most recent issue of their newsletter about rushing in. In fact, she uses this very word, that there's a lot of eagerness. We're going to run in and solve all the problems of humanity with sex education, sex a go-go. She used that. Then she states what seemed to me to be some rather practical steps. And I'm going to read them to you, and let me tell you that I've got a copy of them up front here with me if anybody wants to go to the trouble of writing them down. You may get the newsletter from the Sex Information and Education Council of the United States on Broadway in New York City. If you do, this is in the winter issue. Now let me find out how many of you get it. I'm not trying to embarrass you because I don't want to we'll save that time. Well, you don't get it, so then I'll tell you what she said.
$1.
Yeah, it'll break you up. $2.
$17.90 Broadway.
$17.90 Broadway. Okay, you've got to always know. Thank you. All right. She says, 1. Now, if you want just key words, I've tried to lift out key phrases. I know you can't follow all of the things. Leadership group. Establish a leadership group representative of as many elements of the community as possible. School administration, teachers, parents, clergy of all faiths, medical and other family helping professions, and the communication media, and I've got to come to the defense of the newspapers. There are a few responsible guys in the business, and if you can find them, as George Crane says, and I disagree with most of the things he says, and especially when he's talking about religion, but as George Crane says to the newspaper men, have you ever heard him make this speech? You probably haven't been to a newspaper conference. He says, you are the chief educators in the world. They are. When you and I stop teaching, people keep reading them. The second point. a series of meetings. Now we're talking about steps of getting the job done in your community. A series of meetings. In a series of meetings, explore such questions as what is reproduction education, what is sex education, at what ages is each best done, what exactly do we want sex education to accomplish, who can do it, how can they be prepared for it, how do we interpret to the community what we are trying to do, etc., 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 as the panel has said. But the point is, the series of meetings is conducted for the leadership group. And the third, study materials. Provide this leadership group with study materials which expand their knowledge and understanding in the field and provide a solid basis for continuing dialogue. And the fourth step, young people. Involve the young people themselves in the dialogue. Find out what they want to know. Find out what they're feeling, what their needs and questions are. Involve each age group then in planning for the next age group below them. And the fifth thing, don't forget adults. Make sure that any effort to educate the young about responsible human sexual behavior are matched by efforts to do the same on behalf of the adult population. The sixth, a continuing process. Remember, sex education is a continuing psychodynamic process. The conclusion. During the past month, I've been traveling with the Indiana Division of Alcoholism in workshops for clergymen. And these busy clergymen have expressed the frustration which some of you may be feeling. How can I do any more than I'm doing? Anybody feel like that? And your answer to that question will determine whether this conference makes any difference in your life and in the life of the people in your local community. And so I put before you two statements by teenagers. The first is a letter from a girl. Please, someone do something about it. Doesn't anybody care why so many teens are turning to sex instead of perhaps to religion or to parents? Doesn't anybody care about all the young people who are being forced into marriage too soon? Or about teenage girls in homes for unwed mothers? Doesn't anyone want to stop teenage promiscuity, abortions, VD, and teenage crimes that range from forgery to stealing to pay for these illicit sexual escapades? That is the emotional cry of a frightened girl. Here is a statement by a Berkeley, California high school teacher. No, teenager. See, I'm thinking about you teachers. A high school senior. I don't think I'll use algebra when I grow up, but I do plan to get married.